Hello and welcome to this discussion organised by the Constitution Unit on combating democratic backsliding, what works. I'm Meg Russell, Director of the Constitution Unit, and I'll be chairing today's discussion. We've unfortunately become increasingly familiar with the term democratic backsliding in recent years. For anybody who wants a brief primer on that term, there are a couple of posts on the Constitution Unit blog explaining it, which are linked to from the web page for this event, and I hope somebody's going to put them in the chat. But basically, backsliding refers to a process by which elected leaders may begin to unwind democracy by undermining the checks and balances on their own power. For example, legislatures, elections, opposition parties, the judiciary and other public bodies, and citizens' rights. This term has now been applied to many countries, with classic cases including Hungary and Poland. Only in the last few months, we've seen mixed results in such cases, with, for example, the ejection of Bolsonaro in Brazil, but the likely survival of Erdogan in Turkey, and the pressure from both citizens and political elites against judicial weakening in Israel. In the UK, we have two clear interests in this question. First, while there have been deep concerns about democratic backsliding in the US around Trump, some have drawn parallels and concerns about our own vulnerabilities under Boris Johnson. But second, we clearly have big concerns about democracy around the world and how it can be maintained and made to flourish. So for both these reasons, we want to know how we can avert and, if necessary, reverse backsliding and who needs to do what. We've heard a lot about the diagnosis of the problem, but what are the solutions? What can domestic actors do, and what's the role for international actors and the international community? We've got a fantastic panel of speakers to explore these topics, so I'm sure this is going to be a fascinating and important discussion. We're joined by Dr. Seema Shah, who's Head of Democracy Assessment at International IDEA, which is an intergovernmental organisation that supports sustainable democracy worldwide. We also have Ken Godfrey, who's Executive Director of the European Partnership for Democracy, which is a not-for-profit organisation with a global remit to support democracy. And last but not least, Professor Kim-Lane Scheppele, who's Laurance S. Rockefeller Professor of Sociology and International Affairs at Princeton University, a well-known figure in this field, and is currently joining us from Vienna. The respondents are going to speak in that order, taking just around 5 minutes each with their opening remarks. In that order. And then we'll have some discussion between ourselves as a panel before opening up to the audience for questions. If you're attending this event live and want to ask the panel a question, please write it in the Q&A function of Zoom rather than the chat. Lisa James, who you can see here on screen, is going to act as our Q&A facilitator, selecting a range of questions and asking them on the audience's behalf. By default, she'll name the questioner, but you can also indicate when submitting if you prefer your question to be asked anonymously. This whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be available afterwards as a video and an episode of the Constitution Unit podcast. You may want to bear that in mind when deciding whether to anonymize your question. That, I'm sure, is more than enough from me. You're very keen to be hearing from our distinguished panel, so let me hand over now to Seema Shah to get us going. Seema, thank you.
Thank you so much, Meg, for the introduction, and good afternoon, everyone. To start, I just want to take a few minutes to reflect on the concept of backsliding. We at International IDEA have thought about this for the past several years. And what we found is that although recently there's more consensus on what people mean by backsliding, which seems to focus around declines in checks on government, credible elections, and civil liberties, that is a recent consensus. For a long time, people would talk about backsliding and refer to sort of more general declines. It's hard from the perspective of people who collect and make data sets, how to make that useful for academics, but also for policymakers. And in our world, we tend to straddle those two groups quite often. And what we're finding is that there's a little bit of a divide between practitioners who refer to backsliding to mean a wide variety of declines and academics who are focusing on these three categories. So that's one problem. The second problem is that focus on institutions, in our view, tends to leave out important measures of access to those institutions. So if we're going to be talking about backsliding as an important and unique marker of decline in a democracy, we feel like maybe we need to think about expanding the definition, not just to focus on performance of institutions, but access to institutions, because equality is becoming more and more of a kind of galvanizing point in the discussion of democracy around the world. Second, the term backsliding can be a problem because it evokes this concept of going back to some previous, less evolved state of democracy. And that assumes wrongly that democratization is linear, which is it is not always, but also that you can go back to a different time. And what we think actually is that because of the way backsliding manifests, it's important to think about why it's not going backward, but why it actually shifts a state to a completely different state of being. And why that, the reason why that's important is because it calls for a specific set of interventions or solutions. So that's important to keep in mind. One of the things that's most useful that's come out of this backsliding discussion is that it tends to start when democratically elected leaders come into office and then purposely dismantle the building blocks of democracy from the inside. So what that's shown us, and something we should have known actually the whole time, is that democracy, no matter how old and how long-standing it is, requires this constant vigilance. And maybe one of the reasons why we didn't think about that earlier on is, again, because we're so focused on building the institutions. How do we set up credible elections? How do we ensure that courts are independent? How do we set up free media? But then that meant that we weren't focusing more on other parts, equality, like I said, in accessing those institutions of power. One of the ways we're tackling this question and idea is to think about what we're calling constraints and balancing mechanisms, which is a two-part concept. The first part refers to what we all know and love as checks and balances. So how do we keep power distributed between the different branches of government? But importantly, we're adding this idea of balancing mechanisms to refer to how people remain in control of decision-making in a democracy. So outside of how power is balanced within the government, how do we make sure that the voices and priorities and needs of citizens remain top of mind for decision makers, that their needs are expressed, heard, and acted on? So here we're looking not just at the traditional actors, but at electoral management bodies, national human rights institutions, civil society, ombudsmen, trade unions, community groups, etc. What we're arguing partially is that we have to, in some ways, go back to basics, but it's a basics reloaded. It's not just checks and balances, it's this other aspect as well. And then finally, what we're seeing is that there's some really hopeful evidence out there. In Mexico recently, we saw how the electoral management body and a surge of popular protests in support of that electoral management body came out and prompted the government to produce a watered down version of a bill that they had originally put on the table to weaken election management. That new bill, known as Plan B, is still hugely controversial, and protests continue. And actually just recently, a court struck it down as being unconstitutional for the way Parliament passed it. In South Africa, it was courts that allowed independents to run in elections. So what we're seeing actually is that traditional checks and balances, especially parliaments, are not able to do their jobs as effectively as we wish. And what we end up relying on largely are courts and this fourth sector set of institutions and people power to keep power in check and fairly distributed. And I'll just stop there for now. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you. There's already so much that I want to ask you about that, and I'm sure that the audience is itching to ask questions. But let's pass on now to Ken, and it's going to get even more interesting, I'm sure.
Thank you very much, Meg. And very interesting to hear Seema's comments. I very much echo the issue about the term, which I think is used a lot in Europe, at least, with regards to rule of law. And there it's probably more appropriate. And when we speak about democracy in general, this kind of linear concept becomes very difficult. And many people use the term, which is not a very easy term, but autocratization instead, to refer to the fact that it's going in a non-pro-democratic direction, more autocratic direction. So for us, the European Partnership for Democracy, we're we're a network, so we have members that work all around the world on supporting democracy, and we've basically obviously been noticing this phenomenon for a number of years, affecting different parts of the democratic system. What I would say, just prefacing my comments, is that we often find it's very much about the centralization of power. It's about the centralization of power. Get it, keep it, no matter how long. Get rid of term limits, for example. We see that in many parts of the world, Latin America, particularly in Africa, of incumbent leaders trying to remove term limits in order to remain in power for longer. And as a result of remaining power for longer, there's a greater likelihood for them to undermine democratic system. And as Seema said as well, many of these leaders have entered through a democratic victory and then undermine system. And also what we've seen, and maybe it's familiar, I think, to people in the UK, is that there's been a change in the sort of accepted norms of behavior internationally. And this is on the part of politicians, but leaders most specifically, that the sort of, I'd say the kind of cost-benefit analysis that's made by leaders on their actions has changed, and they feel more emboldened to lock up a rival or create a fabricated case against a political rival ahead of the elections. All of this type of thing has become more prominent and more frequent. It's not that it didn't happen before, it happened before, but it's just happening at a far greater scale today. And so for us, we research this phenomenon, and we actually, we work on policy issues to try and combat or protect democracy across the world. And I'd say there's sort of three areas that we've noticed where there's been success in undermining autocratization. The first of those is really obvious. You mentioned at the beginning, Meg, it's elections. Donald Trump lost, Bolsonaro lost. There are many other examples that we've seen over the last 20 years of would-be autocrats losing in elections and therefore being unable to continue their project. And actually, unfortunately, there are also examples of those leaders losing elections but remaining in power. Zimbabwe is a maybe very emblematic example, but there are many others, Chavez in Venezuela, for example, of losing elections but still maintaining power. A second of those is we call sort of building alliances. And there it's alliances both at the domestic level, so between political parties, but also with supranational institutions, which is quite maybe familiar to people in the European context. And I guess Kim will touch on that afterwards. But when it comes to political parties and the cooperation between opposition parties in order to remove an incumbent. And so once again, it's relying on elections to remove would-be autocrats or firmly entrenched autocrats. There we've seen a number of different examples of success and many examples of failure. So we're exploring sort of why sometimes does this work and why does it not work. Take an example of Hungary, for example. There was an opposition coalition, it didn't work. Again, Turkey, we think it probably hasn't worked as well. But at the local level and city level in both of those countries, it has worked. So in Budapest, as well as in Ankara and Istanbul. And we have many other examples. Czechia, the Czech Republic, recently the opposition was successful. In India at the local level, as well as in the provincial level, there have been successes in terms of coalitions. Malaysia as well. There are many examples of coalitions being successful in removing autocrat. And the final one is protest. And that should be very obvious. But of course, there are many instances where people from institutions, bureaucrats, but mainly citizens, of course, and often organized protest, is successful in combating particular moves by government to undermine democracy. Israel is a very recent example, those protests on judicial reform. Poland 2021 is another good example. South Korea 2016, Malawi 2019. There are many examples that I could read from that I have listed here that we've collected. And of course, those protests, most of them, to be very clear, do not succeed. So this is not something where it's a magic silver bullet. You can say, oh, great, we'll have a protest and it will work. It's a very small percentage of these that succeed. But often it is done in the context of sort of last resort, because the institutions, for example, the parliament or opposition, is unable to withstand the attack on democratic institutions. So I'll leave it there and looking forward to the discussion.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, Ken. And finally, over to Kim.
Great. Thank you so much. So I think the angle that I would like to take that fills in some of the blanks already is the angle of law and legality. Because however it is we describe backsliding, one of the big features of it is that in the most successful cases, I mean, successful as in an autocrat entrenches and stays there for a long time, they do so with law. And this is what really distinguishes the present collapses of democracy from the ways that we used to see democracy collapse, which was in coups. You know, the military would show up, tanks in the streets, then you'd know it was all over. These kinds of takeovers are much more stealthy because first they start with elections, that virtually all of these new autocrats are elected. And then they do what elected leaders are supposed to do. They pass laws. So it takes quite a while, oftentimes, for observers to figure out exactly what's going on with all of these laws. And that in many ways gives the autocrat a head start because they get a grace period when they first come to power. Like, of course, they promised they would change everything. And here they are going through the duly elected parliament, and they are passing laws. So what's wrong with that? Okay, and this is where I want to add to what Seema and Ken said. Everything has to do with the content of these laws. And you're in trouble when these laws actually start to systematically remove, particularly checks on executive power. And when they systematically undermine precisely the institutions that Seema said were the most effective at stopping all of this, courts and fourth branch institutions that are supposed to be independent. And then it's all over when they finally change the election law so that no other party can possibly come to power. So let me just say something quickly about the EU context, because this is an area where law has really dominated both as the mechanism that both Hungary and Poland, our key rogue states, have used to consolidate autocracy. And it's been the main way through which the European Union and the Council of Europe, I might add, have responded to this. So in Europe, you see this as a fight of laws. Now, when the Viktor Orban government came to power in 2010, he literally started by passing thousands of pages of laws through the Hungarian parliament. These laws had been written before he came to power. They were divided up among different law firms in Hungary, paid for by the party. So literally when Orban came to power, he was just shoveling laws through the parliament. Even the people who introduced those laws into the parliament didn't know what they contained. Part of this was to pass a brand new constitution, a whole series of what are called cardinal laws, which are laws that require a 2/3 vote to enact and a 2/3 vote to change. And both the Constitution and the cardinal laws meant that as long as Orban could maintain 1/3 of the seats in the parliament, he could effectively block any rollback of the key elements of the system. So this was all happening in the first few years. The European Union responded, and since I'm talking primarily to a British audience, I always feel like I have to say this. The Commission knew exactly what was going on in Hungary. And I remember asking some of the high-level officials of the Commission, why aren't you doing something? And one of them said to me, well, because if we start messing around with the internal constitutional structure of a member state, Britain will vote for Brexit. So we can't let that happen. Therefore, we can't do anything about Hungary. So Brexit has even wider consequences than all of you know. In any event, the Commission didn't know what to do with Hungary because every step was legal. And Hungary did something that a lot of these autocratic states are now doing, which is they look around for other examples of the worst practices of good states. And then they adopt the exact same law. And when criticized, they say, oh, yes, we have completely disproportionate election districts, but so does Germany. Why aren't you complaining about that? Or yes, we privatized our universities and now you're complaining about academic freedom, but we just borrowed the model of privatization of universities from Finland, right? And so the commission was tied up in knots by these examples. Now, when Poland, and so they didn't do much actually for the first 10 years. Poland came in, and that was a different story because the Polish government, duly elected, they did not have a constitutional majority. So a lot of the things that they did to capture institutions were illegal under Polish law. They just did them, even though the president and the prime minister and the head of the party all had degrees in law, and the head of the party had a PhD in law. By the way, the Orban circle is all lawyers too. So this is something particularly in Eastern Europe. Putin's a lawyer, can go on through, who were the ones doing all this stuff, and a lot of it's lawyers. But in Poland, since everything was illegal under Polish law, the commission felt it could act, and it sort of came in with a variety of infringements and invoked something called the rule of law framework. That said, Poland at some point just stopped cooperating with the EU, and that was when the EU really got stuck. So let me conclude by saying, so what else do you do if all of this is legal, if the commission's ability to file infringements depends in some measure on the illegality of these actions under EU law, and EU law is very limited in what it reaches? What can you do? And this is where the EU has recently, as in the last 6 months, finally turned to following the money. So both Poland and Hungary rely heavily on EU subsidies to maintain what they're doing. Poland has the largest absolute amount of EU funds. Hungary has the largest per capita amount of EU funds. And finally, after a lot of objections from the states called the frugals, namely the Netherlands, the Nordic states, occasionally France, sometimes Belgium, under this pressure, the Commission has put in place, and the lawmaking process has solidified, several different mechanisms for cutting funds to member states that are not following the rule of law. The most obvious one was something called the Conditionality regulation, which was mostly an anti-corruption measure that allows the Commission to withhold funds that are likely to be misspent once they get to the country. And the Conditionality regulation was invoked for Hungary in December. They're withholding 6.3 billion euro under that authorization. Not for Poland, because Poland has many problems, but corruption's not the big one. And by the time the Conditionality regulation was enacted, it was mostly about corruption. So what else could be done? Well, it turns out, as most of you will know who are following the EU budget now has this lovely little addendum called the Recovery and Resilience Fund. And when that was being passed, that's a supplement to the EU budget that is funded by borrowing on the open markets. So suddenly the other member states started saying, why are we going into debt to underwrite these autocratic governments? And so a number of conditions were built into the recovery fund that has meant that all of the recovery funds for both Hungary and Poland are now being withheld pending reforms of the judiciaries in both countries, which is really a big deal if the Commission sticks with it. And then finally, there's this law that only an accountant could love called the Common Provisions Regulation. Hundreds of pages of accounting standards about what you have to do to ensure EU funds are properly spent. And somehow, as this law was going through the lawmaking process, the Commission stuck in this thing that said, and by the way, you have to spend all EU funds in a manner that is consistent with the Charter of Fundamental Rights. So it turns out that when you add these three together, as of December last year, Hungary now is missing 28 billion euro, and Poland is now missing 110 billion euro that it thought it could count on, and those funds will be withheld until they make some changes. So now we're in the process of seeing, do fiscal sanctions work? And the answer, and I'll end here, is we don't know yet.
Thank you so much. Those were three really fascinating contributions to get us going. I can see that we've got some questions coming in already from the audience, and Lisa's going to round some questions up and put them shortly. But I would like to encourage more of you to submit your questions, and in the meantime to get a conversation going with this fascinating panel. And I guess one thing that just comes across from all of you is there's a domestic angle to this, and there's an international angle to this. And in the end, I think it's going to have to, it has to be domestic actors which turn things around on the ground. But what's the interrelationship between the two? And what are the most sort of effective international interventions? Do they come from sort of international NGOs? Do they come from bodies like the EU? Do they come from individual other external governments, from intergovernmental organizations? How can they happily work together in order to make the things that need to happen on the ground happen on the ground? Should we go in the order that we went initially, starting with Seema and then Ken?
So I would say that we've seen kind of mixed results on the power of international organizations to have any effect domestically. And I think one of the problems is that if you are going to be an international body that tries to step in, you need to have some legitimacy in that country in order to be listened to and to have your concerns or to have your points be validated, not just by the leaders, but also by the population that you're talking to. And I think that that's missing in a lot of cases. What we've seen work in some cases is regional courts. So regional courts, human rights courts especially, are able to pass really pro-democracy, progressive decisions, which are huge, can be considered in themselves huge wins. But I think the sticking point is the enforcement of those rulings. So in a lot of cases, the court will come out, make a judgment, and the relevant national government will even come out in support of the judgment and say, that's great, we agree. And then 20 years later, you see that nothing has actually happened in terms of implementing that judgment. So I'll stop there.
So I think Kim maybe can speak about the European Union, but I think the European Union has been extremely slow in responding to what's happened in Hungary and Poland. I think under this commission, so since the changes in 2019, there's been an acceleration, there's been a realization that new tools are needed. And there's been, maybe the commission has been a bit bolder, and that's probably due to political alliances changing between the Hungarian and the German governments. But to me, there is a role that can be played, but I also think that to a certain extent, so a couple of the things that I mentioned, opposition coalitions and protests, there's not really that much for international. This must come domestically, shouldn't be pushed from the outside. And what can be done, for example, if you look at the protests in Georgia earlier this year, there was an attempt by the Georgian Dream, the government in power, to enact a foreign agent law. It led to quite significant protests, but there was also members of some member states of the European Union and the European Union making very clear statements that this would have a big impact on EU accession or the potential for EU accession candidate status of Georgia, and therefore definitely had an impact on the situation in the country. So I think there are some things that the international community or outside actors can do, but I think it's much smaller than one would expect, particularly for it to be a success and a long-term success.
And Kim, both the other speakers, I think, have touched on this slightly, this question of legitimacy. And obviously in the UK, we know only too well how bodies like the European Commission can be presented as sort of, even more out of touch elites than you have domestically. So how does that interaction, how can it work?
Yeah, so this is one of the really interesting features of what's happening inside the EU, is that whenever Eurobarometer does these polls saying, like, is it a good thing for your country to be in the EU? Or has the EU benefited you? The countries that wind up with the highest scores on those questions have, for more than a decade and a half now, been Hungary and Poland. Okay, unfortunately, the UK was not high up on those numbers for all the reasons that you know. And when you have, as you have in Hungary, a complete echo chamber for the government press, the numbers are now falling because all they hear is bad news. But these were countries that worked very hard to get into the EU. It was considered an exclusive club. It was considered the guarantee that they had made it in the world. And so this is where there's a kind of a big effect of shaming. So when the EU, when any EU official, no matter how small, says something negative about Hungary, it's like headlines in the press, and ditto with Poland. And what you see is a bounce down for the government when that happens. So at the moment, the EU has tremendous symbolic force in these countries, because remember, these were countries that spent, a lot of time dreaming of entering these clubs. I mean, the UK always thought, yep, it's there, we'll join it, we can leave it, whatever, we're fine. It's a different relationship to this than feeling like you're finally included. So the EU has a lot of power. And that's where I think that enforcing the rules of the club, like, so these rogue countries are now in a lot of these clubs, and especially the EU level, both in the Council of Europe and in the EU. So the first thing you can do to kind of dismantle this is to try to enforce the rules of those organizations. And this is where, if you could get an independent judiciary, and this is where I think, there's certain key institutions that you need to focus on first, because if you have those, then you get the rest. And I think judicial independence is one good place to start. And there's actually a huge jurisprudence now of the Court of Justice on judicial independence just in the last 5 years, ditto with the Court of Justice. So there are these legal standards now that if you have anyone in country inclined to follow them, it's sort of clear what they would look like. And to add to something Seema said, it's true that in the regional human rights courts, and this is true in Europe, Latin America, and in the African Union, the regional human rights courts are doing something really interesting now in response to backsliding, which I'm just putting in quotes because we don't have another term for it. I agree it's not a great term. What these courts are doing is they're taking individual rights and converting them to structural guarantees. So you see these courts developing, for example, a jurisprudence on judicial independence. And the way they do it is they start with the individual right to a fair trial. And then they say, sorry, I coughed, I just didn't want to blow your ears up. But anyway, so then they say, well, there's this individual right to a fair trial. And what would you need to have a fair trial? And the answer is an independent judiciary. So these human rights courts working with individual rights have now started elaborating these structural guarantees. So you're seeing now like a web of international standards that any new democratic government, if you could get one, could use to bring the country back online again. The big problem in this whole area is how you get rid of the guys you've got if they're the ones who have locked in their power by law, and that's the big problem.
Can I ask you a question about individual countries? I mean, maybe I can start with Kim here, because you are from the US and usually based in the US. Traditionally, we might have expected the US to be a big player in this field. I mean, how much has the arrival of the Trump administration and then the switch to the Biden administration, how much has that changed the international scene? How much does that matter to the dynamics of all of this? And maybe related to that, what is the UK government doing, as far as you know, and what should the UK government be doing in this space?
Well, the fact that both the US and the UK were, 2016 was the earthquake in both countries. And the fact that the two oldest democracies that felt free to preach to the world on this subject were both hit by these kind of earthquakes at the same time, ironically concentrated the minds of people who work on this elsewhere, that this was not just a matter for new democracies, but there was something much bigger going on. So there's something, it's a kind of useful cautionary tale in this happening, and there being a real shakeup of sort of constitutional fidelity in both countries. That said, both the UK and the US have powered a lot of these institutions. There's a wonderful book, ginormous book, but this was my teacher and I adore him and he taught me everything I know about this, Brian Simpson's book on the creation of the Council of Europe system, which was very much a British project. If you're going to get rid of your empire overseas, let's do Europe, is sort of the summary of that book, right? So there's a sense in which the very Convention on Human Rights was kind of a British post-war project to try to bring Europe into line. And if Britain is sort of abandoning its commitments to European institutions, I keep thinking, the Tories put in their platform, let's get out of the Convention on Human Rights, and accidentally they got out of the EU instead. But who knows, the Convention on Human Rights might be next. This weakens these institutions because these were the governments that were responsible for constructing this post-war order in which transnational cooperation with human rights as a big component was supposed to bring peace and prosperity, right? So, yeah, so it makes a difference. As you see, the Biden administration is trying now to come back with this summit of democracies, which failed for Trumpian reasons. Trump cut the budget of the State Department by nearly half. The Republicans in Congress have prevented Biden from raising the budget for the State Department. So the State Department is operating with a skeleton staff and can't really manage a huge summit. So that's why the whole thing kind of fizzled. But as long as Biden is there, the US is going to prioritize democracy. And if Republicans are going to be elected, they're going to go with the autocrats. Sorry. We're working on.
Seema wants to come in. I'm not sure whether she's going to agree with you as another probably US citizen. It's a little bit navel-gazing to ask you about the UK as well, given that that's where I'm sitting. But I imagine a lot of our audience comes from the UK, so it might be interesting to hear about the US influence, but also whether the UK is able to do enough, should be doing more, how it can contribute. Seema.
I just wanted to say that in the context of the US backsliding, I mean, there was a significant portion, and is significant portion of American society, academic, civil society, just regular citizens who were not surprised at all when the US was declared a backsliding democracy. And many people wondered why it wasn't declared that many, many years ago. I mean, there are structural deficiencies when you look at things like gerrymandered districts, campaign finance reform laws, completely unequal access to basic freedoms, based on things like where you live, your race, your income level. I mean, these things are built into the institutions in the United States, which is my home country. So I'm saying from experience. And so it wasn't surprising at home anyway. You're muted, Meg.
Apologies. I was actually going to ask whether Ken wants to come in. I can see that Kim has her hand up, but Ken, would you like to contribute something here?
I'd say a couple of things. One is that I do think there are, while on the one hand, I think this is one of the reasons of what I was saying before, that for better or for worse, the US, such an emblematic power, and the reasons that for what I was saying, that there is a change somehow in the norms of behavior. Definitely, there's a big contribution from the fact that the United States, that Donald Trump was in power in the United States, and just, exactly what he did. There's a positive to me in one instance, which is that it's very clear now that it's not just about the United States or the United Kingdom or others sort of preaching to the rest of the world about how wonderful they are and you should come and join this model. It's more about people who believe in human rights and democracy and the rule of law actually engaging together and saying, well, this is something that we want in Chile, we want it in the United States, we want it in Poland, we want it in Bangladesh. That there's a more common understanding of the frailties of the system everywhere, and maybe a bit more realistic opinion of what can make a system tick. It's not just the institutions, it's the culture and debate that happens within the context of the political system. So that is to me is a very important lesson, and is something that we maybe have only learned as a result of the fact that there have been these changes in certain democracies that were once thought as consolidated.
That's really, really interesting. Recognizing our frailties. Yeah.
Well, recognizing frailties. The one thing I would say, though, very practically speaking, is so what I was speaking about Georgia before, but I think there is a case to be made that in the international engagements between United Kingdom or the US and autocratic states, something can be done that improves the ability of the US, the UK, and others to not help consolidate the power of autocratic regimes. And this is very much the case for the rule of law mechanism, the conditionality mechanism of the EU. Stop giving money to autocrats that is rent free, basically. This is money that can be used in the same way as a rentier state would use income. There's very little strings attached. There are, but not really from a political point of view. And so I do think there are ways, including with things like trade agreements or export of dual-use technology and things, where it could be those countries could be much more effective.
Wonderful. Thank you. Kim, did you want to come in very quickly? I have one more question that I'm very keen to put to the panel before we go to questions.
Just something very fast. I don't want to let the institutions off the hook, and even though I agree with everything Seema and Ken said, so I'll be the institution law person on the panel to say that one of the big dangers in the U.S. Constitution was the fact that the executive branch is regulated by a very tiny piece of text in the Constitution, and for various reasons, the executive is almost always immune from lawsuit. So the question is, what is the law that governs the executive branch? And in the US, most of the law that governs the executive branch is given in legal memos from the White House counsel's office or the Justice Department to the president. And as legal advice, it's all secret, which is to say that when Trump started doing all the stuff he was doing, every lawyer who's ever worked in those institutions understood that it was illegal by the norms of those offices. But because the memos were secret, they couldn't even sue based on it or act based on it. So there's a great group, and if you're worried about what's happening with democracy in the US, one of the groups I work with is called Protect Democracy. And it was built from people who worked on the staffs of Justice Department, but particularly White House counsel's office in multiple governments. And they're the ones who've been bringing all the lawsuits, they know they can't win most of the lawsuits, although they've actually won more than we expected. But in their lawsuits, they're just trying to surface in the investigative process those secret memos so people see what the norms were that was being violated. So, there are things you can do with law that actually can be moderately effective, although I want to say it's culture, civil sector, and so on. Thank you.
Thank you so much. If you're out there and you've got a question, we have some good questions, but if you think you've got a good question, do stick it in the Q&A function and we'll see if we can get to it. But let me just ask one last thing. I was so struck by something that Seema said, well, two things really that Seema said in short succession. I would love to get your thoughts on this and then maybe the other panelists as well. Firstly, you mentioned Mexico and those demonstrations out on the streets in support of the equivalent of our electoral commission, which we saw here. And I would love to know, what are the dynamics that get people out on the streets in support of an electoral commission? That seems so, people were so mobilized, and I would just love to know what lay beneath that. How did that happen? And then the other question, which I would like all of you to address, I mean, maybe Ken in particular would like to talk about the sort of under the bonnet stuff that actually gets citizens active in a similar way, because you talked about some of those things as well. But I think at least two of you referred to something that Seema said, which is the problem of legislators. Now, I'm a parliamentary specialist, a legislative studies scholar, and it strikes me that in our democracy, Parliament is absolutely central because we have the tradition of parliamentary democracy. It's in effect a constitutional guardian as well as a policy maker. But the legislature is an important block in all of these places because you cannot, as Kim says, make law, get law through unless you have people supporting you. And so legislators are an important line of defense in all of these places, everywhere around the world. What can we do more to mobilize legislators, to make them realize their constitutional responsibilities, to make them operate as an effective roadblock? Seema, you were rather dismissive of them, and I just wonder whether you've thought about how we can do better, and then I'd be very interested in the others' thoughts.
On the Mexico point, I agree. We also thought it was phenomenal that so many people would come out in support of an electoral management body. I think that's very unique to Mexico because INE, the EMB there, has such a incredible reputation in the region and also domestically in Mexico as being this really, in some ways, the face of Mexican democracy. It's one of the most trusted institutions in the country. It also has done an incredible amount over the years to reform the way elections are carried out and to promote a lot of public trust, and also to do things really in service of voters. So unlike what we see in lots of other parts of the world, the way that INE runs elections in many ways is really facilitating the right to vote. It's whereas other institutions in other countries treat elections as a privilege. There, you know, for example, they have these mobile registration vehicles that go around and help people register to vote, people who don't have permanent addresses or people who are more nomadic in their lifestyle, et cetera, et cetera. And so it has a lot of trust, and people see it as like, this is one of the signs that we are a successful democracy. And when they saw that power being stripped away, I think it touched something kind of about our identity as a democratic nation. So that's what I would say about Mexico. I don't think it's that common to see that kind of support from the population, but also because that institution has a lot of interaction with regular people all the time. It isn't just a once a year kind of, or once every 4 years kind of thing. In terms of parliaments, what our latest data shows is just that effective parliament is one of the data points that is decreasing almost across all regions in the world. And so when we look at the power of parliaments to exercise oversight, it just seems to be waning. And so in many cases, what that means is that people are relying more on the courts to do that work, and on civil society and this idea of people power and getting people angry enough. But in terms of what we can do to correct that, I mean, that's a really hard question, but one place to start would be to figure out how to incentivize, I think, legislators. How do we make this clear that it's in their interests to, I don't know, take this more seriously?
Yeah, I would love to get the others' comments on that, and maybe there's another example of a wonderful grassroots movement. How can we make places as popular as the Mexican Electoral Commission so that people want to come out in support of them? Kim, you've unmuted.
Yeah, so parliaments are a function of the factors that put people in their seats in the parliament. And what you see in almost every declining democracy is that first parties fail and then the democracy does. So very often what you've got are various party dysfunctions, you know, either because the party is terminally divided or because the party is too unified. You know, there's one leader that everyone has to follow. I mean, Viktor Orban personally interviewed every candidate that ran on his party ticket, and he insisted that he have in his desk a letter of resignation from each of them, so that the minute they overstep, he pulls out the letter, right? And so, you know, how could you be an independent member of parliament if you have that level of party discipline? So you need something between chaos and discipline, and it's a big field, and we need to sort of think about that. The other thing is that, of course, legislators are put there by election rules. And I think that, you know, what we have in the global community for asserting or for assessing whether democracies are free and fair are election observation missions, which still by and large assume that elections are stolen on election day. But actually, in all these autocratic systems, the rules are rigged. You know, it's gerrymandering, it's who gets to register to vote, it's what kind of ID you have to show at the polls. It's the legal structure that determines whether elections are free and fair. And frankly, with all due respect to the enormous dedication of election monitors, they are almost always outgunned at understanding how the rules are rigged ahead of time. So we have to get better at that. And then finally, there's one other thing that makes parliaments weak, and that is that it's the very thing we were talking about, which is as international organizations become more important and are strengthened, it's the executive that represents the state in international organizations almost exclusively. So the more international organizations gain power, the more the executives gain power, and it throws off the balance between the parliaments and the executives. We saw that in Brexit. Miller 1 was exactly all about that, right? So the point is that unless we think about ways of representing parliaments in international organizations, we're not really going to have a way to counterbalance the increasing power of executives.
Well, there are such fascinating insights coming out in this discussion. Ken, quickly, and then I'm going to bring Lisa on the screen with the questions from the audience.
I'll be quick. Just on Parliament, I think I'd echo what Kim said about the fact that often the simple matter of fact is that the parliament is controlled by the executive because it's the same person and their party that has won the democratic vote. What I would also say is that we shouldn't forget that many political systems are not built the same way as the Westminster model, and therefore the parliaments are not as powerful or capable of holding the executive branch to account, or have less, the executive branch potentially has more power. And I think there are ways to support that. There are examples of parliaments that do wonderful things for holding the executive to account. Kenya is an example. The Kenyan government tried to push through a tax on civil society and foreign agent bill a number of years ago. Kyrgyzstan too, they were both blocked by parliament. So there have been examples of parliaments trying to support other entities within the political system. So I think it is a worthy point, Meg, of further exploration. But from what we can see, it's not the institution that tends to combat backsliding.
We are doing everything we can at the Constitution Unit to remind legislators in the UK about their constitutional responsibilities. We've got a project on constitutional principles and the health of democracy, but we are just a small voice. I think maybe we all need to think about this a bit more, what we can do internationally on this. Lisa, I'm sure you've got some fascinating questions for us, and I think I would encourage the speakers maybe not necessarily all to answer all the questions, because then we'll get through more questions, and I've seen that some of them are a bit targeted at particular speakers. So what have you got?
That's right. We've got some really interesting questions, and we're going to start with a couple that pick up some of the definitional challenges that we talked about at the beginning. So Robert Saunders, who's at Queen Mary, University of London, asks, rather than democratic backsliding, are we really talking about a shift from liberal democracy to authoritarian democracy, which promises to champion the will of the people against anti-democratic elites? Many of their supporters genuinely believe that they are the Democrats. So how do we rebuild public support for democracies that are liberal, pluralist, and bound by law against regimes that are themselves using the language of democracy? And then a linked question from Sandra Kroger, who is an associate professor at the University of Exeter, who says definitions have generally focused on state institutions, rights, on access to those things. What are the panel's thoughts on broadening these definitions to also include practices and norms or values among the population? And she invites also reflections on a seeming paradox that when we look at democratic backsliding, we look at the state. When we look at undoing it, we put the responsibility on the population. Is there a paradox there?
Ken, I haven't started around with you. Would you like to kick off?
I think the first question is a very difficult one, and I think it's essentially the use of power. Viktor Orban's very happy with calling himself, a liberal Democrat. I think here we need to focus on the fact that there are certain rights and freedoms, and Kim maybe mentioned it with regards to election observation, where there are certain things that are undermined that still mean that autocrats succeed in competitive elections that are free on the day of casting your ballot, but not fair. And this has been very clearly identified. The playbook is very similar in many countries. If we look at Turkey, the airtime of Erdogan and the opposition is drastically different on television. We saw with the use on social media. So I think that the use of language of democracy has been very successful of those who are undermining democracy. And it gets back to the point that we were mentioning before, that they are successful at the ballot box. And hence why my points at the beginning were very much focused also on the ballot box, that there is a need to defeat them also in the democratic arena, despite the fact that it is unfair, in order to really demonstrate that they are anti-democratic. And it sounds strange, but this is often the tactic that is used by opposition forces. So I don't think there's any easy answer to that. I think that it's a very effective use of the term democracy, and it's very difficult. Unlike rule of law, it gets to something else that we were discussing. Rule of law is much easier to define, in my opinion, than democracy is easy to define for many people. Hence the ease with which the Commission tries to deal with issues of rule of law and maybe shies away from issues of democracy. So I think this is very much focused on I would pull it back to the issue of populism and how populists, however you might define them, are using the terms of democracy to pit the people, as they would define them, against elites. But I don't think there's an easy answer to that.
Who else would like to come in here? Kim?
Yeah, so I've been actually using a really simple definition of democracy, which is, can the people throw the bums out when they get sick of them? And so that focuses on a whole range of things, mostly on elections, because I agree that elections are going to be crucial, but it also focuses on what the people can want. And that is where, in almost all of these defining democracies, you see a kind of monopoly on the media. You see a restriction on the civil sector. You see a restriction in the ability of political parties to operate. And so what you get is a democracy. I mean, Viktor Orban will always say that he is a Democrat, but it's all kind of a fake democracy. They've set up the institutions that look like the moving parts of a democracy, but they don't function like that, you know? And so I think that in order to kind of get at this question of whether the people really are voting for what they want, we have to get people to put democracy first. Because in many of these countries, I mean, the US and Britain being two of them, you see that if you ask people, how important are independent courts? How important are free and fair elections? The population scores in the 90th percentile, you know, on all these things. And then they vote for leaders who don't believe in that stuff. And it's because they put the people are putting democracy second to something else. So we have to think about what those other things are. And I'm about to cough, so I'm going to stop.
That might leave Seema to come in and comment on something that I think she's probably very, very well qualified to comment on, about this question about norms and values in the population, because I think you spoke about that already, and that was an interesting question from Sandra.
So if I'm remembering the question correctly, I mean, one thing to keep in mind is that actually what we're seeing is that in 2021, I believe the World Values Survey reported that a majority of respondents no longer rated democracy as terribly important, and that the statement, it doesn't matter, having a strong leader who doesn't have to bother with parliament and elections is fine, or even acceptable. So support for those kinds of values was growing, sometimes pretty significantly. And so then that leads you to question, why? What is democracy not delivering that makes people so sort of willing to cast it aside? And I think this goes back again to how people define democracy versus how experts define it, and what people expect out of democracy that maybe practitioners or policymakers either don't know about, or which is not maybe a fair expectation of a democracy. I don't know the answer, but I think those things need to be figured out so that we don't miss the boat on sort of saving the legitimacy of the democratic model. Not to mention that the sort of dominant model of liberal democracy doesn't have a great reputation everywhere, because it's seen as imposed, an imposed model that doesn't give any sort of credence to popular concerns and worries about how it doesn't fit with people's expectations, like I said.
Very interesting and somewhat depressing. Lisa, what else have you got for us?
So our next round is on the role that different actors can play. So Harry W. asks specifically, Seema, you talked initially about different categories of oversight bodies, many of which were top-down institutions, but you also mentioned trade unions and community groups. Could you expand on those more bottom-up approaches? The questioner is coming from the perspective of being critical that we can innovate our way to better democracy from the top down, and that it's the lack of wider democratic culture that is part of our democratic malaise. An anonymous attendee asks a very different question. Is there a role for legacy institutions like the monarchy of the UK in preventing democratic backsliding? And finally, from Mikhail Koneyev, a question on protests against democratic backsliding. Is there a way for Western liberal democracies, to better support pro-democracy protests in authoritarian regimes like Belarus, Iran, and Russia?
Wow, 3 very good and very different kind of questions. I think maybe we start with the first one and go back to Seema, because I think it's quite a natural development from what you were just talking about democratic awareness and grassroots pressures. Talk to us a bit about those organizations and how we build those bottom-up approaches.
So I think I don't think there's one answer to how to build them, but I think I 100% agree that the solution is not going to come from top-down institutions alone. And there needs to be some kind of popular demand for this, which makes officials feel like they better do something, essentially, if they want to keep their jobs. So, I think it really needs to be a combination, and there needs to be communication. And that's why in our analysis, we're focusing more on the fact that fourth branch institutions and people power, for lack of a better word, is the way forward, because it can't all be in institutions. One of the examples that stands out in my mind is the farmers' protests in India. That went on for a year, I think, at least the main part of the protests. And they succeeded, and the Modi government backed down on those bills that were threatening their minimum prices. And those farmers are now actually coming back out to say, there were a bunch of promises you made when we stopped protesting, which you haven't delivered on, and we're back to sort of demand accountability on that. They've also participated in sort of other protests for other actually social rights things that have gone on in the past year. So there's lots of examples. I don't think there's one model.
Just got something in the way of my screen. I was going to suggest Kim, and Kim indeed wants to come in. Go ahead, Kim.
Yeah, so again, on the model where the EU is now defunding rogue states, one of the things a number of us have been working on in the context of the EU is, can they fund other things? Can they fund cities? So, for example, one thing we see in Hungary and in Poland, but also in places like Turkey, you've got sort of liberal enclaves in the cities, liberal not in left-right sense, but in the, believing in constitutional democracy sense, in cities, and it's the rural areas that are the dilemmas. Same in the US, actually. In the EU now, we're talking about, can we direct EU funding through cities and not just through the national government? Can the EU fund the civil sector? Can the Euro parties start to help set up or support parties within member states that actually would pluralize the political space? So one possibility, I know that sounds rather top down, but it's funding to enable a bottom-up response, because the question is how you coordinate that bottom-up response. So, the problem is that, again, what a number of autocrats have done is they know the power of the civil sector, and they've populated that civil sector with what we call in the US AstroTurf organization. So AstroTurf is a brand of fake grass, right? And fake grass roots look like AstroTurf groups. And so in Hungary, they've got think tanks, civil sector groups. I mean, the civil sector landscape looks incredibly vibrant until you realize it's all growing out of the party state, and they've crowded out all the other groups. So you have to be very careful in thinking about how you support independent civil sector groups, and not just ones that are affiliated with the governing parties.
We do have the specific question about supporting protests in certain countries. I think Belarus was one of the places mentioned. I don't know whether you, Kim, or whether Ken would like to come in on that. And then we have the question about the role of the monarchy, that I think, Ken, you're the Brit on the panel, and that might fall to you.
I don't think the monarchy can do much, in my opinion. But legacy institutions, I mean, there are monarchies in other countries around the world, but it's definitely not my expertise, what they could do. What I can say on protests is that I think it's very dangerous for external actors to be overtly and even covertly involved in protests in other countries. Although it does happen for sure in democracies by authoritarian regimes and by democracies in autocracies. I think this is natural in international politics. What I can say is that as pro-democratic organizations, I think it's very important to support activists once they are imprisoned for doing something that is perfectly authorized under law, and even if it is illegal in the country, making a statement in favor of certain human rights. So maybe the people are kicked out, they're a human rights defender, an activist that has to leave the country. I think it's important that democratic regimes support these people who are courageously standing up against authoritarian regimes. In the context of Belarus and Russia, there are lots of challenges, I know, even practical ones, because people have left the countries, and there's been significant clampdown within both countries on even what I would call very indirect forms of support to democracy, like environmental protests in a particular city are becoming much harder, those instances. I think there is still a role for international actors, but it's increasingly become supporting people who are really in exile. So providing free sources of independent information, media, supporting journalists outside of Russia who might be based in Netherlands or Latvia or something like that, to provide information to citizens in Russia they can access. So I think that there is a role, but obviously there's a need to be very careful to not try to influence the protests, and the protests need to be by people themselves and really driven that way.
Fantastic. You're a very efficient panel at answering questions. We're getting through lots of questions, which is great. So I'm going to probably unprecedentedly invite Lisa to give us another round of questions, because we always run out of time. Lisa.
All right. What I think will be our final round is focusing particularly on law and the role of courts. So Francesca Klug asks, would you agree that the international human rights framework established after World War II, of which regional human rights courts are a fundamental part, was partly conceived to preempt democratic backsliding or more populist forms of democracy, and that this is the reason perhaps why what Francesca calls the drivers of Brexit are now turning their sights on the European Court of Human Rights? A linked question again from Sandra Kroger, who we heard from before. What do you all think is the role of the legal profession in resisting backsliding? We rarely talk about them, but they seem central. Are they doing more than we know, or why don't we talk about it more? And finally, a more general question from an anonymous attendee who asks, what should we all be doing to halt backsliding or forestall backsliding in our own countries?
Fantastic, thank you. What shall I do? Who would like to go first? Kim?
Yeah, let me take up the question about lawyers and legally trained people, because one of the things you see in country after country is the engineers of backsliding are very often lawyers. I call them lawyers in chief, you know, when you get a circle of lawyers that are running the government, as in Russia, as in Hungary, as in Poland. Or they have lawyers behind the scenes, as in the clever thing that Erdogan did when he switched from parliamentary to a presidential system, a kind of dream extension of his term of office that could only have been thought of by lawyers. So if lawyers are the architects of these systems, they need to be called out by other lawyers who see things coming earlier than the average person, just because your legal training gets you to see where these folks are going before they actually get there. So lawyers strike me as a really important early warning system in this whole panoply of things. And it also raises some questions about how we do legal education. You know, in many countries, and again, the UK and the US lead among them, we tell students, you know, your own personal views of these cases don't matter. We teach you to argue the best, you know, everyone deserves representation, and we teach you to argue the most effective case on the side to which you have been assigned. And then the question is, do we really want to train a bunch of, you know, like legal assassins for hire if they happen to get bad clients? Now, you know, it's a trick, because I don't think we want to leave people without representation. On the other hand, I think that we've gone way too far in saying that lawyers actually, you know, are kind of neutral players and don't bear responsibility for the maintenance of the constitutional system. So, you know, I think it needs to be part of legal education that lawyers, first and foremost, have got to stand up for constitutional democracy, and they need to resist incursions on that when they can.
That's very interesting. I might say, I mean, you could just nod. We can extend that to academics beyond the law faculties as well, because academics rather have this sense of neutrality as well, but can maybe see things coming because they've read a lot of books about the past. Ken?
I don't know if I agree with Kim that everyone in the Russian government is a lawyer. I think they're all KGB. No, I'm joking. No, so that I very much agree. And I think there are people along with Kim that have been doing wonderful work at EU level to, a whole group of lawyers or legal professionals, even academics, who have been pointing out potential ways for the European Commission to deal with the thorny issue of Hungary and Poland. And honestly, without them, I don't think the file would have moved, or this problem would have moved forward as well as it has, which is not well enough, but still much better than it would have otherwise. So I think there's definitely a lot that the people in the legal profession can do. On the last question of what individuals can do, I think I would say, I think being involved in politics is very important because, again, I'll come back to it, they're often winning at the ballot box. So being involved and engaging is really important. Protesting, if you disagree, is also very important. I think everyone here will be politically aware who's joining this conversation and understand these type of things. So it's maybe rather obvious from that in that regard. But I do think if one looks at the US political, the situation in the United States, so much hangs on people going out to vote. So the mobilization of vote, we've seen it in the UK recently as well, but this mobilization of voters is becoming a more important issue around the world with regards to democracy, because people are realizing that even in instances where the electoral competition is not fair, it is free. So you need to get the people out and you need to get them voting, because that's the way that you can win. But I guess that's all rather self-explanatory.
Not at all. Seema, you get the last word. And I think you've talked a lot about bottom-up approaches, so you're very well qualified to talk about what we individually can do in our countries. But if you've got any thoughts on Francesca's question about the human rights framework, then that would be useful too.
I don't think that the human rights framework was necessarily built because people were thinking, oh, we need to think about mitigating backsliding. But I do think it was built partly because it was seen as integral to everyone's definition of democracy. So many times we divide human rights work from democracy work, thinking that it's separate, but it's actually completely intertwined. And we need to remember that, I think. In terms of what people can do, I think I agree with everything Ken said, but I would say to even go broader than that. It's not, voting is important, but it's definitely not the only thing you can do. And it's not even just about protesting. Join your whatever organizations are in your community that are doing work that you think is important or that's just relevant to your life. Having a say at the most local level is very, very important. And I think will be more important going forward. We don't have wonderful measures of really deep local democracy. That's one of the things missing in the quantitative world. And so we're looking more and more there, partly because that's where so much of the action seems to be, is at the local level. I would just close by saying that having the right laws on the books is really obviously crucial, but it's not nearly enough. I mean, what we have in our data, for example, shows that almost every single country that holds elections is extremely high performing in inclusive suffrage. But how many of those countries is it actually a reality that everybody has equal access to the ballot box? It's completely, if you look at how people feel in terms of their access to the ballot box versus what's on the books, there's a huge gap. And so I think we need to also, in our evaluation of democracy, do much more to look at what people actually experience every day, rather than just expert views.
Thank you so much. You have been a fantastic panel. This has been a wonderful, somewhat depressing at times, but nonetheless very lively and enlightening conversation. I think there have been some really interesting ideas coming out. This idea about recognizing the frailties of democracy, I think, is really important. And some of these ideas about who's got what responsibility, lawyers have got responsibility, academics have got responsibility, but we can't just leave it all to the lawyers and the politicians. We all have responsibilities to get active and be vigilant and look after our democracies. Thank you all of you, to the speakers. Thank you for the audience for being here and for your questions. I noted earlier that there will be a video and a podcast version of this event available shortly. I certainly want to listen to it back again because I think it was such a rich conversation, and I would encourage anybody here, if you've enjoyed this, to maybe do the same, but at the very least recommend it to your friends and family and colleagues to have a listen, and it'll all be on our website soon. Our next event hasn't yet been advertised, so let me give you an early view of what that is. On the 28th and 29th of June, the Constitutional Unit will be holding its annual conference. This is going to be an online event looking across the UK Constitution and asking what positive changes we can make. I'm trying not to look backwards too much to some of the difficulties of recent years, but thinking ahead to party manifestos, what politicians maybe should be promising for the future. We've got panels on Parliament, elections, the territorial constitution, constitutional standards, the role of the courts, and putting constitutional change into effect. So look out for news of that very shortly on our website and on Twitter. And if you're not already signed up to receive our event mailings, then do go to our website and sign up to hear about our events as soon as they're made public. But that is, again, more than enough from me. We've gone over our time. Thank you once again to our panel and to everybody for attending. And goodbye from us for today.